Hello, everybody. Let's kick it off. And let me get into my slides. Here you go. Here is a shortened link and a QR code that will let you access the slides that I'm using today. It will take you to a view-only Google Doc, and then you can make a copy and use that copy in any way that you want. You'll be able to see the alt text that's embedded in the images. You'll be able to click on resources that will pop out from the deck. You'll be able to take notes on it if you would like to. So I will just pause for a little moment here and allow everybody to be able to use the QR code or the link if they would like to. I will be glad to come back to this slide at the end of my presentation in case anybody wants to use the QR code or link at the end. This is just the slide that says, "This is my work, please don't steal it." And for people who have vision or reading difficulties, I will be reading the text on each slide aloud. We're also going to do a little bit of reflective writing during this presentation. So if you can take out a pen or paper or open up a doc or a Word file for yourself or a notes thing on your device, just have those ready for the couple times when I'm going to ask you to think about how some things might apply to your particular situation. I always start my presentations by thanking the people who have taught me. So I want to say thank you to everyone who was at the Digital Pedagogy Lab in 2017. Charles Bailing and Roger Fisher, who are from the Program on Intergroup Relations at the University of Michigan. Karen Costa, Clay Mahoney, Judith Duttill, Melissa Whaler, Jessamine Newhouse, Liz Norell, and Josh Eiler, who are all part of my sort of pedagogy circle on social media. My colleagues from Knox College, including Gabriel Rayleigh Carlin, Jennifer Frubear, Deirdre Doherty, Hilary Lehman, Jessa Dahl, and Mary Arman. And of course, to my students who are teaching me all the time. This is our agenda for this afternoon. I'm going to introduce myself in a slightly different way, and then we're going to talk about the difference that educators make in our students' lives. We're going to talk about kindness and education and whether these two things sort of sit happily with one another. And then we'll talk about where we begin to think about kindness in our instructional spaces. We will talk about what a pedagogy of kindness is, and I'll give you some really concrete examples from my teaching of ways that I've changed over the last several years. And then I'll bring it all into a conclusion at the end. So, first of all, I am Cate Denial. This is my seasonal picture. I have one for the summer too. I am originally from Sheffield in the north of England. And if you can't hear an accent, that's because I've lived in the States for about 30 years, but also because I went to school an hour south of where I grew up, which was about as far north as many Southern students would go. They didn't understand my dialect. And so I learned to just mimic whatever I hear. That's great unless you get me in a room full of people from Texas. I'm a first generation student, and this is my alma mater, the University of Nottingham in England. I emigrated to the United States in 1994 to go to grad school at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I got my PhD in US history from the University of Iowa in 2005. And then I went to Knox College, where I'm a professor of American history. And this is perhaps the most beautiful picture that's ever been taken of our campus ever. My specialties are the history of women, gender, and sexuality and of Indigenous people. I was a faculty ombudsperson for 6 years and chair of my department for 7. I am a giant Captain American fan in all his incarnations. So much so that I had my public history students make an entire exhibition about Cap in historical perspective. I love to bake and I hate to cook. I am presently reading John Warner's More Than Words right now, which is about writing in the age of artificial intelligence and is such a great book. My favorite TV show right now is The Pit, which is on Max. I love to paint watercolors, to play the banjo very badly, and I love to knit. I am very pleased to meet all of you. So let's talk about the ways in which educators make a difference in the lives of their students. I want to begin by saying a sincere thank you to you for the work that you do with your students. In general, as educators, we don't always expect to be thanked, and we don't always get the thanks that we deserve. So here is a thank you from me. I did not make this. This was art that I found online. I also want to start with a quote from Emarina X. Daniels, who has written this beautiful essay called Kindness Eases Change. She talks about when she does professional development programs with various faculty and educators. And she says, when I meet teachers in person, they so often come into the space guarded, nerves vibrating, on high alert. Their uncertainty and distrust is dense, filling the air and my lungs. It pierces my heart that asking teachers to explore and imagine conjures up feelings of risk and danger. We cannot be truly kind to others if we are cruel to ourselves. So, if we desire kindness, we must practice being kind internally and externally, she says. As we bring kindness into those public spaces and face our own fear of change, we bring an undiscovered tenderness to our students and communities. Education could be the place where we learn how to be kind, to be tender and caring for each other in public. And kindness is a step in that direction. So I think educators are a special sort. And that's not just because I'm an educator. Educators don't just tell students what to do, what to think, or how to be. Educators shift perspectives, enlarge worlds, and help us find the places where we belong. My most recent book is dedicated to two very special educators from my life. Mr. Winter taught me World War I poetry when I was 8 years old. This was my first reckoning with war. I learned a lot about loss, grief, love, and waste. Mr. Schofield taught me working class history when I was 15. Until then, I didn't exist to myself. All of history was simply kings and queens. I was a working class kid. I would have been a peasant or a factory worker. No one taught those stories in my school. In Mr. Schofield's class on the Industrial Revolution, however, I existed. I learned about people like me. I learned that the world in which I lived had been contested and I belonged. I am not alone in having educators who made a huge difference in my life. And recently, I made some social media posts asking colleagues and friends to weigh in with stories of educators who had changed their lives. And one theme really stood out: educators change students' worlds. This is from Crystal Johnson, who's a museum professional in Chicago. I had a French professor who scheduled weekly lunches with us in the cafeteria to help us practice our spoken French and learn French etiquette. He also ran the study abroad program. He was wonderful. Since we were from the middle of nowhere and he was bringing us the world, it was especially significant. Travis Lau is a poet, and he says, I owe my entire poetic career to a TA who, on his free time, introduced me to HIV/AIDS poetry when I was newly out and 18. He wanted me to be accountable to the history of queer people if I was going to identify. It was the greatest gift, as he didn't have to do any of that. Jenny Thigpen is a history professor. I'm forever grateful to Cindy. She took me seriously at a time when others did not. She saw in me what I could not yet see. She held me to the highest standards as a sign of her respect, but she also treated me with real kindness and compassion. She is absolutely why I ended up in this profession. And Leslie Margaret Ward is a journalist in Ireland. When I was at Loyola College studying law, Dr. Philip McCaffrey, my lecturer in an elective in creative writing, pulled me aside to ask why. He said, don't you know you're a writer? I didn't. My inner voice did, though. He saved my life in so many ways. Forever grateful. All this to say, you really matter. Our jobs can be exhausting. We can often feel burned out. And saying it is that you matter is not a solution to those problems, but it is something that exists alongside those other truths. You are making a difference. And I'd like us to pause for just a couple of minutes and for you to reflect on a time when someone demonstrated to you that kindness makes a difference in education. I will keep time for everybody. So take a couple of minutes and just jot down some memories. That's 2 minutes. Thank you so much for taking those moments to reflect. So let's talk about kindness and education and how they sit with one another. The pedagogy of kindness takes as its starting point the idea that people are not setting out to be unkind to one another or to their students. The problem is the culture of higher ed in which we're all swimming. A pedagogy of kindness keeps us oriented towards compassion despite the pressures around us. It provides structure to make our innate kindness visible and practical, and it humanizes everyone involved in education. I always ask people when I'm traveling and talking about this stuff, is higher ed kind? And usually the answer is, in general, no. We are socialized into distrust. There are powerful cultural stories all around us about what success means in post-secondary education. And those stories include things like the solitary genius who is supposed to be the apex of achievement in higher ed, working away in a lab or in an ivory tower in a solitary office. This person needs no one, depends on no one, but just makes wonderful work. The idea that research matters above everything else is also part of this socialization. And that really does a disservice to the work that people put into teaching and service. There's competition between students for zero point 0.9 of a point in one of their classes or to get a slightly higher grade than the person sitting next to them. Competition for fellowships and scholarships, competition to get into graduate school, competition for jobs and for other jobs and for permanent positions and tenure. Competition is everywhere around us. There's also all the hierarchy in higher education and the way that that often works against collaboration. And there's terms like smart and intelligent, which we often use without considering that those come to us from the eugenics movement. There's also the legacies of exclusion in higher ed and all the people who have been shut out for many generations. And we're only just beginning to do the work to redress that. When I was a graduate student and started teaching, I was taught several things about the students I was about to meet. They were our antagonists. They plagiarized. They cheated. They wouldn't do the reading. They would challenge their grades. And basically, I should expect them of something nefarious at all times. So I'd like you to think back to your early years in academia. Reflect on how you were socialized into higher ed. Now, maybe like me, you got socialized into antagonism. But maybe you had wonderful mentors who gave you really great advice. Either way, I'd love for you to think about how it felt to start out as an educator, what worked and what didn't about that socialization. We'll take just a few minutes, and once again, I will keep time for you. Okay. Thank you so much for thinking back on that moment. So, we all hopefully learn to do better than we did when we first walked into a classroom. We learn from experience, we learn from our students, we learn from our colleagues, and if we're lucky, we learn from professional development. For me, there were four key things that really led me to focus on kindness. The first was a project called Bringing History Home that I worked with in Iowa for 10 years. This was a program for teachers, K-12, although we mostly worked with teachers from K through 5. There were 900 of them in Iowa. We taught them how to think like a historian and how to do what historians do so that they could then teach their students at an age appropriate level. So kindergartners did things like the history of me or the history of my day, and then learned historical thinking skills. The teachers that I worked with in that project were some of the kindest, most generous, and patient people I've ever met. And I think any elementary school teacher has to be patient and kind in order to do their job. It's certainly one I couldn't do. The second thing is that in the 20 teens, I was trained in intergroup dialogue at the University of Michigan. Intergroup dialogue is a way of having very, very special and constructed conversations around issues to do with race, gender, sexuality, other big social issues of our moment. This particular way of having those conversations was rooted in compassion. And like many things that are great in any one classroom, it sort of slopped out of its bucket. And I started using those techniques and those ideas in all of my classes. The third thing is that I have post-traumatic stress disorder. Being kind to myself was crucial in order for me to begin the path towards recovery. And so I had to learn to sit with my emotions and offer them so much grace in order to be able to make progress and heal. The fourth thing was that I went to the Digital Pedagogy Lab in 2017. I thought I was going to learn some cool new digital tools, and I certainly did. But first, I was asked to critically question everything about my teaching life. DPL was the first time I had been asked so bluntly to defend my pedagogical choices. And once I reflected, I found much of my pedagogy indefensible. At the time, I felt regret and no small amount of embarrassment. My teaching was undone by the presence of a question that was never articulated quite this directly, but was everywhere around me. Why not be kind? So let's define our terms. What does kindness mean to me? Well, first, let's talk about what it's not. Kindness is very, very much not about being nice. Niceness puts band-aids over deep wounds in our institution, and it lies. It lies about things like precarity and the impact that that has on individuals and institutions, power imbalances between people in departments and across campuses, things like tradition and rigor on what we actually mean when we deploy those terms. It lies about burnout and exhaustion and just how prevalent those are in our profession. And it lies about what we're supposed to give to our students and to one another. Kindness, on the other hand, I would argue is about honesty, especially honesty on three particular fronts. The first is positionality. Academia continues to be hostile to so many of us along axes of race, gender, sexuality, religion, nationality, citizenship, disability, and class. Where do we have power and where do we suffer from its lack? It's honest about accountability. To dismiss the places where we trip in word, thought, or action without reflecting on the impact of each is nothing more than being nice, relieving ourselves of responsibility and prioritizing feeling good over being just. It's also honest about being a discipline. We will not always feel like being compassionate. We do not need to direct our energy into niceness. Instead, we need to remind ourselves that we believe in compassion and act upon that belief, even on the days when we are spitting mad, hollowed out, and heart sore. So, if this is what kindness is, where do we begin to implement it? Well, the place we start is with ourselves. Kindness towards the self includes things like incremental change. It is very tempting sometimes to want to burn everything down, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy and time to build something back up in its place. So instead, I always suggest that people choose one change that they could make to their teaching in any given semester. See how that lands, make some adjustments, try a second thing the semester after that. It's also about recognizing that you know your job and what is necessary and workable in your particular situation. It's about knowing the boundaries that you need and that will work for you. And it's about giving yourself time and space to do this work, especially the reflective part of it. As I've been traveling and talking to people about a pedagogy of kindness, I've been collecting ideas from people about what kindness towards the self might look like. So these are small things that you can do that nevertheless have a big impact in terms of our kindness towards ourselves. The first is setting email hours and communicating them clearly. It is not a requirement of anybody's job that they be available on email 24/7. It's not even available that you have to be available 7 days a week. As long as you tell your students in plenty of time and in lots of ways exactly when you will be available and what sort of turnaround time they can expect, then students are good with it and they know what's coming. Take a day off from email every week if you can. If you can't do a whole day, take a whole morning or a whole afternoon or a very long evening. We are always pouring out into other people. And so it's important to fill our own cups. And taking that time away from the ping, ping, ping of other people's demands is really important. Take time for lunch or dinner, depending on your schedule. I learned this when I was diagnosed with diabetes a couple of years ago and realized I couldn't live on Snickers bars and string cheese between classes anymore. I had to actually make an appointment with myself to eat real food. And once I did, I wondered why I had never done this before. So now that goes on my calendar like it's a meeting. It is an unavoidable appointment with myself. I never schedule anything else in that time. Commuting is work, and we should count it as such. Mostly, this is about how much energy we have in a given day. We don't arrive at our office fresh as a daisy with 8 full hours of energy in us. We've already expended some of that in getting to work. So being realistic about what we have to be able to give at our place of work is important. I always advise people to build some flex days into their syllabus from the very get-go. So before a student even sees it, I have a couple of days that are always at the end of the schedule on my calendar, and those days have nothing in them at all. When I get sick, or my students get sick in large numbers, or there's a concept that needs more time to be discussed, or we just didn't finish the problem we were working on, I can move one of those flex days into place. And instead of running to catch up and cramming everything in after an absence, there's room for that class to breathe. And the last thing is that we need community. We are not creatures who are supposed to be in isolation. And your community might be your department, but it might not. It might not even be on your campus. But knowing where your community is and where you can turn for support and strength is really, really important. And if you don't know where to start, I have some great ideas that are in the book, and I could talk about those in the question and answer period. So, what is this pedagogy of kindness? Here's all of the pre stuff. What does the actual pedagogy of kindness look like? Well, a pedagogy of kindness has 3 parts. It's about attending to justice, believing students, and believing in students. We're going to start by thinking about justice. Your student body is tremendously diverse along multiple lines: race, gender, sexuality, religion, class, age, and disability. Some of them have kinship responsibilities and are engaged in deep care work. Others, and sometimes the same people, are employed as well as trying to be in school. So, what does this have to do with kindness? There is a sea change happening in how people engage with their education, and it can get frustrating and exhausting for educators. We need to understand the many directions in which we and our students are pulled and do justice to those factors. We need to rethink engagement. This is my colleague, Karen Costa, and she has a wonderful piece that I've linked for here that's all about student engagement. She says, when I ask faculty who I work with what they most want for their teaching, hands down, the most common answer is student engagement. Costa says it's not that students are disengaged, but that they're engaged with and by other things. We often want students to replicate our patterns of engagement. We want them to be students in the way that we were once students. But Costa says our students are deeply engaged in learning, in activism, in dreaming and enacting a better world for all life on this planet. And she talks about desire paths. So as you look at this image, you can see that on the left-hand side, there's a paved sidewalk. And along the top of the screen, you can also see a glimpse of another paved sidewalk. So there are ways to walk here that have been officially sort of made, but you can also see a desire path, and that's the rutted footpath that goes off towards the right, where people have gone, I just really need to head over to this building from this spot. And so many people have taken that path that it has worn away the grass. This is a desire path. Costas says, are we willing to pave that desire path with our students? Are we willing to broaden our understanding of student engagement? We cannot assume that the things that seem apparent to us about education are apparent to our students. The pandemic has done more than make us ill, grief-stricken, and overloaded. It has prompted people to reconsider their relationship to work, to office space, to education, and to life goals. Now more than ever, we cannot rely on our own belief that our disciplines are full of useful and worthy information and automatically expect students to agree and find meaning in our assignments. We must take a hard look at what we're asking students to do and identify if there is value there. If there is, we need to be able to explain that value to students as clearly and directly as we can. So justice and kindness looks like questioning our assumptions. Do we know who our students are and crucially who they are not? It's about extending the benefit of the doubt to students, especially when we encounter something we think is maybe a little outlandish. And it's about suspending our disbelief, believing in what and how much students are telling us about their educational experiences. So that's justice. Let's think about believing students. It's about starting from a position of trust. Remember the ways in which we said some of us were socialized into suspecting students are up to no good? We need to actively choose to rethink that. You may have heard or seen these statements before. My printer broke. I was sick. Someone died. My laptop crashed. These are common reasons that students offer for why they couldn't get a given assignment done on time. And I would say in every instance when you hear this, you should believe the student who's telling you. It's about cultivating trust, not only with the student standing in front of you, but with all the other students who are going to hear about that interaction or witness it in the classroom. I usually get a question about this, and people ask, well, isn't someone going to try and get one over on me? And that's certainly a possibility. But the other possibility is that we disbelieve students in genuine crisis. I would rather deal with the outlying situations when they arise rather than suspect everyone of something nefarious from the outset. Even if a student is lying about a particular thing, a particular reason they didn't get the work done, there is an underlying problem to address. It is a trust centered practice. So let me give you a concrete example of how this worked out in my teaching. It's all about class participation here. This is a standard sort of set of accommodations that I was given for a student whose name I have blocked out on this particular thing. And it's very common. Things like extended time on quizzes and exams, a quiet, distraction free environment for all testing, things like that. And of course, I do all of these things because that is the law. I am mandated to do them. But accommodations, if they're going to help one student, it is very likely that they're going to help other students too. And this is where we think about universal design for learning. Universal design for learning comes from the idea of universal design in urban planning and architecture, where you might have a wheelchair ramp, as you see in this illustration, and that's going to help someone be able to get into this building if they are in a wheelchair. But that ramp is also going to be helpful to people who have mobility issues in other ways, or maybe parents who have a stroller with a kid in it. So, class participation, how did I get to universal design? Well, first, the problem. Teach a lot of discussion based classes, and participation is super desirable in those classes. I needed a way to assess if students understood the material, and assessing participation seemed a good way to do that. It was a way to evaluate their learning and their thinking. And so I made class participation 25% of my final grade. I then got an accommodation notice for a student who had severe social anxiety, making it extremely difficult for them to participate in the way that I had expected. So I had to brainstorm. And I decided that the student could send me an email at the end of the week telling me what thoughts the readings and discussion had prompted in them. But then I realized, what about the students who couldn't afford the time or the expense of being tested and diagnosed with social anxiety, but still had it? So I brainstormed and thought that students could ask to send me an email at the end of the week telling me their thoughts about the readings and class discussions. But then I realized that was only going to work for the students who felt comfortable telling me about their anxiety. So back to the drawing board. I decided everyone could ask to send that same email at the end of the week telling me their thoughts about the readings and class discussions. But then I came to Universal Design for Learning. I realized I needed to make it possible for everyone to do some kind of work, in this case, a written reflection, before class conversations so that participation was expansive. So I came up with reading check ins. They're on the left side of the slide, and you'll see that the first question I always ask is, how much of the reading did you do? I make it super clear to my students that this is not about me being punitive if they didn't get it all done, but simply a sort of early warning system. So on the days when everybody only gets half of the reading done, I'm prepared ahead of time. I ask the same questions every single time. What new things did you learn? What do you think it's important we talk about today? And what left you confused? And then there's a last thing that says, is there anything else you want to share? Which is where my students often tell me about music or movies that they love, but also where they might say things like, I just broke up with my partner. These are ungraded reflections. So I do not spend time reacting to these. There is no direct feedback on these particular forms. They are due the night before class so that I can review them early in the morning. And then I use the observations and questions that my students raise in these forums to shape my lesson plan. That way, there's a feedback loop and they see that the reflections really matter. This is all grounded in believing students when they express that talking in class was a significant challenge. So that was believing students. What about believing in students? Well, that means believing in students' creativity, their thoughtfulness, and their capacity to learn. It's about collaborating with students on their learning. So let's go back to some concrete examples and think about the syllabus. On the left side of the screen, you see the first page of a syllabus that I wrote in 2017 before I went to the Digital Pedagogy Lab. And at Digital Pedagogy Lab, I was asked, who is the student you're imagining as you write? What do you communicate about who you are in the way you talk about policies? And is your syllabus accessible to as many students as possible? I had to tackle each of these questions in turn, and I realized the student I was imagining as I wrote was someone I did not trust. My syllabus was dense and legalistic and outlined all the things I thought might go wrong and the consequences if they did. What did I communicate about who I was? That I was in a position of unassailable authority and was not approachable. This was drastically different from the persona I had in the classroom, but that left my students wondering who they should trust, the person in front of them or the person who had written the document. And was my syllabus accessible? No. It was a giant wall of text. So this is the opening to that syllabus blown up a little bigger. You can see that I don't welcome students. I don't say hello. I don't introduce myself. I simply list a bunch of things, including one that is very hard to parse. So there's my email address, and then it says 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., except 5 p.m. Friday to 5 p.m. Saturday. But I don't explain what that means. Then there is one of the more boring descriptions of an American history class ever committed to paper, and then I leap straight to the required text. This is another page from that same syllabus, and you can see that it is incredibly dense. This is an injustice. This sort of dense writing is hard for students with ADHD or reading comprehension difficulties to be able to parse. They have difficulty finding the information they need. I didn't believe students. I had harsh, convoluted attendance policies that were really draconian, and I didn't believe in my students. I believed that they needed a distant, authoritarian person to show up in this syllabus if we were going to get any work done. This is what one of my syllabi looks like now. And I don't offer this to say your syllabus should look just like mine, but to say this is how I resolved some of the problems I saw in that 2017 syllabus. I have a cheerful header now, and that is welcoming. And I also have alt text embedded in that image so that people using screen readers still know what the image is about. I use a much clearer font that's easier to read than on the other one. I welcome my students to class and I model pronoun use. I don't require them to use pronouns, but I signal that I think it's important. And then I am very transparent and clear about my boundaries. So I tell them they can reach me by email, and now I explain what the mythical figures mean, right? I'm available by email from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday and 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Friday. Saturdays and Sundays are my recharge days. This is another page from that same syllabus. And you can see I used icons down the left side of the screen to help students navigate the text and find the things that they needed. There's also a UDL framing in this, much as in my other class. I don't use a lot of red or green, for example, in case students are colorblind. I also maximize the means of communication that I give them. And here, it means I give them a phone number and an email address to reach the head of our Disability Services Division. And now we also have QR codes and I can link them directly to their website. This was my statement on the Knox College Honor Code in the before times in 2017. The Knox College community expects its members to demonstrate a high degree of ethical integrity in all their actions, including their academic work. Examples of academic dishonesty include plagiarism, which I don't define, giving or receiving unauthorized help, which raises the idea that maybe there is authorized help, voluntarily assisting another student in cheating. So, can you involuntarily do that? And dishonestly obtaining an extension. This is what that paragraph looks like now. We, not just them, but we commit ourselves to act with academic integrity this term. And a definition: to be ethical in what we say and write, and to offer credit to others for thinking of ideas before us. And this is probably the most important line in the whole thing. I believe that everyone in my course is fundamentally honest. Again, this is me preferring to deal with the outliers if and when they occur, rather than suspect everyone of something. Now, a lot of colleges and universities have boilerplate language that you have to include in your syllabus. What do you do with that? That's not in your voice. Well, you can have the students annotate the text, which is an idea that I got from Remy Kalir. I just clicked on his link. I'm so sorry. I was like, what is happening? The annotations can take place in class or they can take place as homework. I like to give students the syllabus at the end of the first class period, have them annotate it for homework and bring it back to the second. You can collect in the annotations and read them through, or you can have a discussion with students about their thoughts, which is the way that I tend to do it. If you have large lectures, you can have students talk to a partner or in a small group of 3 or 4. Now, if you're worried that all of this is going to make your syllabus far too long, then Andrew Delatonio from the University of Texas, Austin has a great suggestion. He has this one-page syllabus summary at the front of his syllabus, and it links automatically to all the other pieces that students might need. It makes it super easy for them to find what they're looking for. So different concrete examples, that's the syllabus. What about assessment? I like to do what we call authentic assessment, and that's where there's meaning beyond the classroom and an audience other than you. It's about believing in students to do really remarkable things. So at Knox, we have a thing called Biofuels Week. The general chemistry students create a biofuel. The organic chemistry students identify its components. And the physical chemistry students perform combustion tests to determine its efficiency. They then present their findings to a panel of alumni. This is what some students had to say about it. This lab teaches me how to work as a team member and how to communicate effectively, which is important for my career as a research scientist. We have a chance to learn not only technical skills, but also interpersonal skills. I think my experiences in all of my labs leading up to Biofuels Week helped me prepare for this. Because we were working with general organic and physical chemistry, there were concepts that I learned as a first year that came back up that week. Here is what it looks like in one of my classes, a website that my students made, which you can actually go visit, that's about the place where our college now stands before the college was founded. They decided what the big themes would be that this website would look at. And so here is material culture, which is one of those thematic elements. They put together a timeline and they had to explain the significance of everything they included on it, as well as including a primary source with each entry. They also wrote individual blog posts in which they showed their firsthand primary source research. And this is why it was authentic assessment. We got an email not long after it launched from Ana Naruto Moya, who is the project director of the Indigenous Digital Archive, saying that she had found the website really useful in the research she had been undertaking. There are other ways of doing great assessment too. Tilt, or transparency in learning and learning and teaching, is another one. So this is a sample tilt assignment from my colleague Mary Arman in the math department. And you can see that she clearly explains the purpose of the assignment, exactly what students have to do, and then how they know that they have succeeded in doing those things. That's the transparency that's at the heart of it. There's also formative assessment. So I have my students do weekly look backs. This is applicable to any discipline at all, where you can have students tell you the top 3 things that they remember as being important from that week. That's a great way for me to take the temperature about whether the things I hoped they got really got through. And it also sometimes tells me where I need to go back and do a little more work with them on some concepts. Emarina X Daniels again. Kindness during learning. As people question, make mistakes, try again, misunderstand, lose their tempers, rage, cry out is ours to sow and nourish. So, what is one thing that you could do to make a course more kind for you and your students in a future semester? Take a couple of times to a couple of minutes to reflect, and I will keep time for you again. That's 2 minutes. Thank you so much, everybody. So, I'm going to conclude by sharing a little bit of poetry with you. This is from a poem called Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye, and is just a small part of a much larger work. Before you know kindness is the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out in the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. Thank you, everybody, for your attention this afternoon. And we are going to swing into a period of questions and answers.
Thank you. To get things started. I think one question I had as I was listening to you, I wondered, for someone who might be very new to this and a lot of these ideas being ones that they're just kind of contemplating for the first time today, where do you think is the best place to start? And then I see some questions popping in after you're done with that one.
I think that the most generative place to start is probably just by spending some time with your syllabus and asking yourself the same questions that they asked me at Digital Pedagogy Lab, especially who is the student you're imagining as you write this? Who are you writing it to? Now, it might not be conscious. It certainly wasn't with me. It wasn't that I thought to myself, let me picture a student who I think is totally distrustworthy. But once I looked at the language I was using, then I realized that was implicitly what I was doing and who I was addressing. And once I saw that, I wanted to change all kinds of things about the way my syllabus functioned. So I think that's a really amazing place to start because the syllabus is this relational document that we hand to our students on the very first day. It makes a big impact upon them, especially if you do something like the annotation exercise to hear what their questions are and what they're thinking about that syllabus. So I think looking at that language is a really, really good place to begin.
Thank you. And I'll start us off. Kelly's got a really good question. She wants to know, are there any philosophers or writers that you're reading right now that might illuminate your ideas or build on them in some way?
Adrienne Marie Brown is certainly somebody who I think has a lot to say about kindness and being authentically in the world. I really admire her work. I'm sort of slyly looking at the corner of my eye at my bookcase, which is right beside my desk. There are a number of people who I really enjoy and who've influenced me. Alice Walker's early work, like In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, was a huge influential book that I read. I love thinking about different voices that are maybe not in my experience and finding people who are really speaking from a completely different life experience that really broadens my horizons and makes me think much more critically about the space I occupy in the world. And yeah, I see that Kelly's saying In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Yes, yes, it's such a great book.
So Irdis Malik says, what advice do you have for us to become better at getting other people, like admin, instructors, to buy in?
I think that there's a couple of answers to that. One is that your students will do the talking for you, that as your teaching becomes kinder and they experience a sort of different kind of classroom that's not antagonistic in any way, then they're going to talk about that with their friends. They're going to talk about it in other classes, and the word sort of spreads. I also think that it's just really, I'm not an evangelist, despite being here and talking to everybody, right, with my little headphones on. It's not that I think that people need to be converted, but I do think that just having conversations about, like, have you considered whether we're being kind in our classroom, or asking, what does kindness look like to you when you're enacting that in the classroom? And being genuinely curious about other people's answers is a great way to get those conversations going.
Building on what Yerda said, Travis is wondering, kind of related to that, how do you get kindness buy-in among students or toward the instructor, thinking about reciprocity around kindness and how it can be really tricky?
One of the difficult things about practicing a pedagogy of kindness is that it does not depend on your students being kind back. It is about treating them in a way that is authentic to your ethics and values, and coming back to that even when you are spitting mad. I mean, I had a super frustrating weekend, not weekend, but week of teaching last week, and was so mad at so many people. And I had to keep coming back to, I know what the kind thing is to do. I know how to conduct myself. I am not going to portray all of this internal stuff to my students at all. They are going to see me act with kindness. And I save my, ranting or processing for other spaces, not online, spaces with other people, closed group chats, face-to-face meetings with friends, that kind of thing. It is wonderful when students see the example of us being kind and want to emulate it. And that certainly has happened for me. But it is important to realize that if a student is just sort of being ordinary, you still have to be kind to them. Where I draw the line and have a clear boundary is when that steps into being offensive and discriminatory. And there's a large section in my book about what do you do when that sort of thing happens.
Any other questions? We do have Kate for a little while longer. Do we have any questions for her? Kate, are there any questions that you often get from audiences like this that we haven't asked that you're used to answering, I guess?
Yeah, I often get asked how you balance kindness towards the self with kindness to your students. And I think that's the going back to the are you being kind or being nice sort of dichotomy. People sometimes think that what I'm saying is give everybody all the extensions in the world, anything goes, turn things in all over the place, don't show up to class, or just sort of permissiveness in general. And that's not what I'm advocating for at all. I think that's niceness. That's sort of just going along and resisting all and any conflict that could come up with students. And that is not a healthy way for us to treat ourselves or us to treat students either. So that's where I come back to kindness being very honest. So I do allow my students to have an extension on any assignment, no questions asked. They just have to write me and say, I need the assignment. And they don't tell me anything about why. I make that clear. They don't have to divulge private things to me. So they just say, I need the extension. Can I have 2 more days or 3 more days, whatever it is? And then I hold them to that. So if at the end of the 2 days they haven't turned in their work, then we have a conversation about, like, well, what's going on here? And how do we structure this to make sure that you're going to get this work done? Structure, scaffolding, organization, all those things are so, so important. So it's not about anything goes. It's actually about being very, very thoughtful and intentional about how we design our classes and respond to real emergencies that sometimes happen in our students' lives.
I don't see any other questions. Kate, was there anything else, any parting words that you wanted to leave with everyone?
No, just thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I know that it's the end of the day, that people are no doubt extremely tired. So I hope that you have some rest and relaxation ahead, and that you can enjoy the fact that it probably smells really good outside right now because all the snow is melting.
All right, then I will also thank everyone. And I just want to thank you for joining us today. And thank you to everyone. And thank you, Kate, again.
No
Bye,
problem.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.